Hello again, and welcome to another podcast. Now, you may be of the belief that in order to get really good photographs, particularly if you're traveling or if you're photographing wildlife, you need to have really good gear. And the purpose of this podcast is to suggest that that isn't necessarily true. And in fact, this is one of the biggest myths, I think, in photography, that it's all about the gear. So please like and subscribe before I carry on, and now I will. So one of the things that I find very irritating, to be perfectly honest with you, is something I hear pretty often, and that is, I love your photographs, you must have a great camera. And if you are a photographer, hopefully you can relate to this, because to me, it's a little bit like somebody walking up to William Shakespeare and saying, that was an amazing play that you've written, you must have an amazing quill or pen or whatever, because that's what the camera is. It's basically a tool, and a good photographer doesn't need a particular tool to get a good result. So in other words, photography is a lot more about the photographer themselves and their understanding of subjects, how to relate to subjects, how to put pictures together, how to compose, how to tell stories, all of those aspects, how to use light, how to create mood, all of the different aspects of photography. And the camera is basically the tool that they use to do that. But what a very good photographer will do is just adapt to the limitations or the abilities of the camera that they are using. So, for example, there are things I will do with the DSLR that I use, and I'll do it without thinking. I can't do easily with a smartphone camera, but I can still come up with an image using a smartphone camera of a given situation. It might not be exactly the same as I would produce with a DSLR, for example, but it will still be a reasonable photograph, because over years and years of doing this, I'm able to understand what's going on in a particular image. So that's really what I want to talk about in this podcast. And in doing so, I hope I might be able to save you some money as well. If you are perhaps on the verge of going and spending an awful lot of money on camera gear that in the end won't give you the result that you're hoping for. And this is really the what's at the heart of it. And in fact, if you go to the testimonials on my website for my DSLR a mirrorless photography course, one of the testimonials is from a guy who actually states exactly that issue, that he went off and bought a really expensive camera because he thought that was why his pictures weren't really coming out terribly well, and was very disappointed to find, having spent all that money, he was still getting exactly the same results. So this is the most important aspect of photography gear, for sure. It's actually understanding what you need and why you need it. So that's the first bit. Expensive gear doesn't mean great pictures. And in fact, it can even go the other way. It can end up being a lot more frustrating because you've just set your expectations a lot higher by investing money in photography gear that's quite expensive. And it can be incredibly disappointing when you may be getting the same or even worse results than you did with much cheaper gear. So and the serious aspect of that is simply that it can start to put you off photography. And that I think is perhaps the biggest problem of all of this. It's not just the money, but it might be something that you just put this really expensive gear away somewhere and that's it. It doesn't see the light of day again because you're just so disheartened by what's gone on. So let me talk about the kind of cameras that we have available, I guess. So I want to talk a little bit about the sort of budget end of things against the really expensive, the sort of flagship gear. And the thing about that is that absolutely, if you buy one of these flagship mirrorless cameras these days, there aren't so many DSLRs. Some manufacturers are still offering them, but if you're looking for a DSLR these days, it can get a lot more difficult. And it's much more mirrorless. So we'll talk about mirrorless cameras. So what's the difference between a really expensive mirrorless camera and a cheap mirrorless camera, and maybe even a good smartphone? And that's an important question to ask. So the first thing is, what are you currently using? So whenever I talk to anybody about the equipment that they have, or if they ask me, a question I often get is, what's the best camera? And I always like to immediately rephrase that to, well, let's talk about best camera for you. And I don't know what you want to do. So it's really hard for me to answer that question. So let's take it that way. So when it comes to identifying the equipment that you need, the first question to ask is, what sort of photography are you doing? And what do you plan to do with the images that you're taking? So these are two fundamental questions. So it may be that your photography is basically taking pictures at family events. Maybe you're traveling, you want to have something you just got with you and you can take pictures of sort of regular tourist spots or amazing little places that you find, or meals in restaurants, just sort of snapshots that you take in the moment. And frankly, for most people, it's highly likely that the camera that you have on your smartphone, and most of us have a smartphone these days, that camera is likely to be perfectly adequate for what you want to do. And there's a couple of really good reasons to start there, because one is most of us already have that camera with us. And secondly, it's with us most of the time. Most of us really don't go out of the house or even around the house very far without a phone. So that really is the place to start. And if you don't know what your camera is capable of, then learn it. Spend a bit of time getting to know what the smartphone can do for you. Look for online material. I've got a pretty low cost smartphone course. It's very basic, so I've not kept it up to date with the latest smartphones because I want to focus on the fundamentals. And once you get beyond that, there will be certain things that cameras can do, but it will vary from model to model. And of course, those things are changing all the time as well. You may also want things like AI, and AI is definitely with us and has been for a while in the world of cameras. And these are the kind of things where they change backgrounds and all this kind of stuff. So to me, that's not really the kind of photography I'm interested in. For me, photography is about recording what is actually there. It's conveying something of perhaps the emotion that you feel when you're looking at whatever the subject is or trying to connect with it. So all this stuff where you can change the backgrounds and take people out and move them and all this kind of stuff, that's fine if that's what you want to do. And that's definitely out there, but it's not the kind of photography I'm interested in. So I don't really talk about that. But the fundamental thing is to just look at what is it you want to take and how much of that can be met by the gear that you already have. And I suspect for a lot of people that most, if not all, of what they're trying to do now can probably be handled by the smartphone. Now, and just to add to that, it's more a question of understanding what the smartphone is, or what the camera in your smartphone is capable of shooting, rather than having to buy a lot of extra stuff for it. Having said all of that, you may be limited by lenses, and you also need to understand that the lenses on cameras aren't all the same camera, if that makes sense, on the smartphone camera. So typically you might have 3 different lenses. With the front and the back, you would probably have seen it. When you can flip the camera from the front to the back, what it's doing is essentially sticking a mirror in there. So you will have, I think it's generally the picture of you. So when you're looking at the camera yourself, that will be reversed. In most cameras, that's done by a mirror. But also with the different lenses, you might have a telephoto, so a ×2, the standard ×1, and then maybe a ×1/2. So that would be your wide angle lens. Those won't necessarily go to the same sensor. They won't necessarily be shooting at the same resolution. So it's good to just get an idea of that, just so that you understand what your camera is doing. But I do recommend maybe going on a course or taking an online course, just so that you understand your camera, the camera in your smartphone more and what it's capable of. The second question, and it's one I asked at the beginning here, is what do you want to do with your photographs? Now, this is important because if you are looking to use social media, So you want to pop them on Instagram, Facebook, or something else. Again, the images that you're shooting on your smartphone are likely to be fine for that. You're likely to be shooting in JPEG, which, if you don't know, is basically it's what we call a compressed format. Basically, what that means is the information that makes up your photograph that goes into a file. And what JPEG does, it kind of squashes that information down. It reduces the detail of the image just to make that file as small as possible. And the reason we want to do that is twofold. One is it means you can get more photographs on your phone or your camera, whatever you're using. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, if you are downloading images, so then you might be shooting images for a website or just sending them to friends, there's a big speed difference. It's not as bad now as it used to be in the early days of the internet and using these sorts of photographs, but it's still there. You want the smallest possible file because that can be downloaded very quickly. So if you've got a website, for example, and you have somebody jumping onto your website, you really want the pictures to show up very quickly. People don't wait. This is one of the realities of selling online. People have got used to pretty much instant gratification. So if you have a website and you've got amazing pictures, but they're quite big, and it might take 10 or 15 seconds to download them when somebody jumps onto your website, the chances are that by the time those images have been downloaded, they've gone. They've clicked off somewhere else. So this is where you want really small files and maybe bigger files. If you do, if it's a product shop, for example, and you have a detailed page on that product, you might want to use a bigger file there. But certainly for home pages, catalogs, thumbnails, that kind of thing, they want to be small images. So if you are only using those images in that way, then again, a smartphone is likely to be completely adequate for what you need. Where you might want something bigger is if you plan to use them in a photo book, something like that. So this is where you need to start thinking about how good are the pictures that I'm taking. And again, understanding that you essentially have more than one camera on your phone. Which one do you want to be using to take photographs? So that's sort of sticking with what's standard on the smartphone and what you might do with it. It's worth bearing in mind that if the smartphone does most of what you want, but occasionally you might want to zoom in, I mean, in a wildlife environment, that is definitely the case. You might want to do that. There are some workarounds. So one of them is to use clip-on lenses, and these simply clip over. They clip over your smartphone, and the lens of the clip-on lens goes over the lens of your smartphone camera. So that might give you a telephoto capability. It might give you macro capability. But it will add just options for the types of photography you can do with your smartphone without having to spend a huge amount of money. These things are generally pretty reasonably priced, and also without having to carry a lot of weight. And that's also true if you want a little tripod. You can get these tiny little tripods sort of fit in your pocket, and it just means you've got a steady platform for your smartphone. So if the smartphone takes you most of the way there, but there are just a few tweaks to think about, then think about doing that. One thing I did see done in this in South Africa in a private reserve I was on, one of the guides there had a brilliant idea. She just used binoculars and would set the binoculars up and then just press the smartphone lens to the eyepiece, one of the eyepieces on the binoculars, and shoot that way. That gave her a really nice optical zoom, nice big optical zoom, in fact, and she could get in really close. So, be a bit creative about it. There are things you can do with things you already have, perhaps. So why not use them? I'm not one for overcomplicating things. I like to keep it as simple as possible. And if you've already got gear that will do what you want, then do your best with that. Sorry about that. This is great. Somebody's alarm has gone off. Okay. So, the joys of recording outside a studio. So that's the first thing to think about. So looking at the bottom end of the cost market, which isn't necessarily the bottom end of capabilities. I mean, I suppose potentially, but not always. So when you go after smartphones, well, then you're into really mirrorless or the larger cameras. So here we're talking about camera kits, let's call them that, where you have a camera body. Usually, I'm not going to worry about specialist stuff, but we'll look at setups where you've got a camera body, a lens that is exchangeable. You can switch lenses, and then you might have other things to go along with that, like particular lighting setups, all sorts of other things, big tripods, all that kind of stuff. So do you need that stuff? Well, this again comes back to the fundamental question. What is it you are trying to shoot, and will what you have already do what you need to do? So if you already have a camera, you've already got a camera body, and the kind of things I look at when I'm looking at camera bodies are what's the resolution of the RAW file. So I always shoot in RAW, and I'm interested in the resolution because what I do with my image, so again, we're coming back to this question of what do you want to do with the image. I may well be creating commercial fine art prints. So in other words, these are photographs that are going to go through a whole commercial print process. So they need to be high resolution. The finished print files could be quite large. They could be A1 or even bigger. So I need the best resolution I can get on that image. I need it to be sharp. I need the detail to be there. And that's really important. And the way that you do that is to look at first of all, the resolution of the sensor. So mine's a 45 meg, which is pretty big. You may not need that. So there's 23-ish and all sorts of other sort of levels in between. But have a look at this is your megapixels, basically. And very simply, the more megapixels you have, the more detail you will get on the final image if you are shooting at full resolution. So the reason I put that caveat on there is that with a lot of cameras, you can vary the resolution. So you don't, although you might have a really big sensor, you don't have to shoot at full resolution. Why would you want to do that? Well, it can come down to things like burst speed, so how in fact burst speed and duration, so how quickly will the camera take photographs while you're just holding the shutter down. It could be a dozen a second, it could be 30 a second, whatever it is. Now again, do you need that? Don't know what you're doing, but these are things to think about. But this is one aspect. If you're doing high speed bursts, how fast do you need to be, and also how long do you need to hold the burst for? Because it might be something, for example, a humpback whale breaching is over in a couple of seconds. Now, my go-to is still an old EOS 5DS that is really served me well. That one is the 45 meg, and that will shoot at maximum file size, maximum resolution, at maximum burst speed for about a couple of seconds, and then it sort of wheezes and then starts recording again. And the wheeze is just simply, you've got to remember, you've got a computer in there, you've got storage in there, which is an SD card or a flash card, whatever it might be. I've got both in the camera I use, but that computer is having to write the files, and that takes a finite time, and it can only manage that for as long as possible. So another tip for you, when you are buying a camera body particularly, always buy the biggest and the fastest storage cards that camera will support. And then you'll be able to use the maximum performance of that camera. So again, what are you shooting? Do you need those kind of high speed bursts? And again, where my EOS 5 becomes limited is things like dolphins, where if you've ever seen dolphins porpoising, which is basically where they're flying out of the water and in again, they are out and back in again in under a second. They are very, very fast. So there's no way you can look at them through the lens, do your autofocus, and then take a picture. I mean, that's just not practical. So the way you shoot those is to set up a focus box. You do very high speed, shutter speed if you want to freeze the action, and then you just point the camera there and far away. So you might want to do a burst of several seconds, and here the 7D works better for me, and that's a cropped sensor. So it isn't It doesn't give me files that are as big as the ones from the 5, but they do allow me to shoot for longer maximum burst rate. And then I use other software to get the resolution and sort of finesse what I've shot. But again, this is about understanding what those cameras will do. So, what do you need? So if you're looking at a camera system, the kind of things to think about are what I've just discussed. So where are you going to use the images? What are you shooting? Do you need to be really fast? Do you want to blow the images up really big? So the software I use will make images much, much bigger than I've originally shot them, but I like to start with the biggest resolution file I can. So I'm sort of pitching things as much in my favor as I can. And then with the lenses, so let's just look at lenses briefly. What are you shooting? Are they close? Do you need macro? Is it something that's far away that you need to do a long telephoto? Again, that's the kind of thing. So what lens do you need? Now, for a lot of work, I like to use zoom lenses because they give me that flexibility to change my perspective on the subject. I can get in really close or pull right back. And one lens I have is a 28-300. It's a zoom lens from Canon. It's one of their pro lenses. I'm not sure if that's still available. But I loved that when I was doing portrait work, funnily enough, because it meant I could shoot wide angle. But if I was just working with a family and there were young children, I might see that one of the kids had pulled a face or was doing something, and I can immediately just go tight into that face and go up to perhaps as close as the 300mm on that zoom and do that straight away. So I can be very, very fast, and you can't change lenses in that situation, or even change if you've got a backup body with a long lens on rather than the wide angle. You still don't have the time. These things happen in moments. So the questions start to come down to how quickly do you need to react? How fast is your subject? Where is your subject? What are the requirements of the lens? Lighting will be another thing. So usually I shoot in daylight. I do shoot around dusk, and that gets tricky with the gear I have, because the downside to zoom lenses is they tend to be slower lenses. And basically what I mean by that is that when you start getting, well, even in regular photography, you need a reasonable amount of light to get a good image. And certainly when the light starts to tail off, you'll find that your available shutter speed starts to drop off quite a lot. It means you've got to compensate by pushing up your ISO. But even then, you might be right on the limits. And I've done this. I actually remember photographing a humpback whale at dusk off the coast of Sydney, and the camera was absolutely on the edge of what it could do. And I was even turning things off, like not using autofocus, just anything that was demanding time from the camera, anything to just get that camera going as fast as possible. That was how I was setting it. So now that was an unusual situation, but if you're always working at dusk or at night, then you really want something that has very good low light performance. So either you're looking at, in fact, you're probably lucky to find a good zoom lens that would work in those conditions, which means that you're then going back to prime lenses. And prime lenses is basically another name for fixed focal length. Now, the beauty of those is that they tend to produce much better images than zooms. They're often much sharper, particularly the pro lenses from camera manufacturers. They can produce beautiful photographs. They are faster, so for given lighting conditions, they'll have a larger aperture available, minimum aperture, which lets in more light, so you've got a higher shutter speed available, and that can make the difference between something that's just sort of blurry and horrible and very pixelated because you've got a lot of noise on it, and something that's still sharp and lovely detail, that kind of thing. Obviously, the downside to primes is that that's a lot of hardware to be lugging about if you need a number of different focal lengths. So these are the trade-offs. Now, one option, of course, that you have, particularly with digital these days, is that you just shoot a bigger scene than you need, and then you crop down afterwards. And you can certainly do that with a camera that shoots a very large detailed image. So again, you may not need all of the resolution of a big full frame, so like the 45 meg I was talking about with the EOS 5 that I have. But one of the advantages of the EOS 5, when I shoot with that, if I'm right on the edge of what I can do optically with the zoom, I can still grab that image, and then in post-production, I can just crop down and still have a good resolution on that final image. So, there are trade-offs. You might be able to do workarounds on some things. Other things, you're going to be more limited. So this is not to overcomplicate it, but just to really get very clear and very specific about what are the things that are most important for you. So, for example, I also carry my gear. Sometimes I might be hiking for hours to take my gear places. So I have a backpack that I like that's got really good hip straps. So that's something I would always recommend to people. If you're going to be lugging gear a long way, if you don't need immediate access to it, if it's just going to be in a backpack, then get one with hip straps on, because that puts the weight onto your hips and not your back. And I find that a lot more comfortable. So these are the kind of things. So this is really what you've got. These are the kind of questions you have to ask yourself, and then look at what you have. If what you have will cover the needs that you have, then congratulations. You don't need to buy anything. You maybe just need to learn a little bit more about getting the most from your camera. If your camera is short, then you need to get really clear about what you need. Because if you're switching from one body to another, and generally when I've switched bodies, it's because I need better resolution, or there might be, say, autofocus functions like tracking, that kind of stuff. So get together a wish list of what's the ideal specification for the camera that you're looking at. And then obviously it comes down to budget. So you may be able to go out and just buy something brand new that does everything you need, in which case that's great. You might find that to really tick all of those boxes, you're really starting to push your budget, and then you might be looking at something you can't afford. So then you're looking perhaps at second-hand gear. So I would say just try it if you can. Make sure you've got a warranty. If you go from a store, normally you get about 3 months. So there's time there to just exercise the thing and make sure it's all good, everything works. And I would do that as soon as possible. But look at the options, but make sure that if you are investing in new gear, that you understand why you're doing it. And this also goes for lenses. Again, tripods. I don't use tripods very much, but I do like to occasionally have a crack at some astrophotography. And if I'm doing that, I've got a lightweight 1 kilo tripod that Manfrotto do. And that's sort of my go-to there. And I have a much sturdier sort of studio tripod that I'll use for other things. And in fact, that's one that I've lugged up to the top of the cliff to do some astro in Sydney a while back. So get clear about what you need, but be realistic about it. And also, if your photography is changing, because one aspect of photography for a lot of people is that we do evolve our style, or we just change. We maybe suddenly get into sports photography, for example. So again, if you're shooting sports photography, let's say your kids are playing soccer or rugby or something like that, then you might want a longer lens and something that's quite fast. You might even be looking at a prime, but the primes tend to be a lot more expensive. Certainly if you've got several of them, than buying a zoom lens, which gives you the equivalent range. So what do you need? Okay, so I think that sort of comes back to where we started, and that is, do you need expensive gear to get a good photograph? And I've spoken a lot about the type of gear and why you might want certain gear, but hopefully I'm hoping some pennies have dropped for you on what you need and what you don't need. And this is the key place to start. And as I say, the most important question to ask is what I've got now adequate? Will it do the job for me? Because if you answer yes to that, then great, you don't spend any money. The other thing you really need to be aware of, and this comes back to what I said at the very beginning about Shakespeare and having a good camera. is that the most important thing you can do, really, as a photographer, is to really invest in yourself and make sure that you do understand what's going on in the camera. Now, you don't need to understand all of it, but you definitely have to understand the exposure triangle. You need to understand how that's all implemented in your camera. Do you know what modes you prefer to use? Are you an aperture priority person, shutter speed? Do you do something else? Do you understand all of that stuff? Because if you don't, you could well have a camera that's perfectly adequate for what you need, but you just don't know what you've got. So I would go back to what I said earlier, that a good photographer is good because they're looking at what's going on around. They're not good necessarily. Well, I would say they're not good because of the gear they have. That might help. But all the gear can do is it's a tool, and all it will do is, in the end, do what you tell it to do. If you don't understand what you need to tell it, if you don't understand how to use light, if you don't understand composition, if you don't understand the trade-offs for certain situations, so I've spoken about photographing dolphins versus photographing breaching humpbacks. If you don't understand that stuff, then you're really going to struggle, because it won't matter what you buy, you're going to get the same results. So I guess the take homes from this, or the points or the thoughts I'd like to leave you with, are, first of all, do you know what kind of photography you're doing, or you aspire to do? If you're just getting into photography, what do you want to do? If you don't know what it is, then don't buy anything. I would recommend that. Or if you have to buy something, get something very low end, maybe a second-hand kit, but don't spend a lot of money on it initially. When you do have some basic equipment and you start doing the kind of photography that you want to get into, make sure you understand the photography parts of it, so as opposed to the camera parts of it. So what I mean by that is understanding exposure triangle, how to use light, all these things I spoke about before, composition, all of that. If you're shooting really boring photographs and it's down to a composition issue, you just don't know how to compose interestingly, you don't know how to use space, you don't know how to use leading lines, all that sort of thing, it doesn't matter what camera you're using, you're still going to shoot really boring photographs. So I'm sorry to say that to you, but that's the truth of it. So if you don't understand what a leading line is, if you don't understand the rule of thirds, for example, if all of this is sort of technical jargon you've never heard of before, then don't buy anything. Go and understand that, and then you will be able to make a much more informed decision about whether or not what you have right now will do the job for you. So I guess to come back to the initial question of this podcast, do you need expensive gear, or if to get great photographs, do you need expensive gear? The answer to that is no. But what you do need is to understand what it is you're doing when you're being a photographer. You need to understand photography basics. You need to understand exposure triangle, how light works, how the camera fundamentally works. Like as with any tool, you wouldn't jump into your car and then try and drive off without any kind of knowledge or instruction at all. Most of us drive cars. Most of us do it without really thinking about it too much when we've been doing it a while. But it's another skill that we've had to acquire, and we become unconsciously conscious to go through those, or not skip through all of those steps, but that's the sort of outcome. So that's really where you want to be with your photography. Unconsciously competent. And that simply means that you are able to use the camera, able to use good photography theory, able to assess what's going on with a potential image. So just in the same way when you're driving the car, you can read the road and you're looking at people who are going to pull out in front of you or do whatever, all that kind of stuff. It becomes second nature after a while when you do it a lot and you pay attention, and you start to become more subconsciously aware of what's going on than having to focus and be really thinking about it hard all the time. You want to get to that stage with your photography as well. You want to be unconsciously competent with the way you use a camera, but equally unconsciously competent with looking at a particular scene. So I did a podcast a little while ago, how to think think it was How to Think Like a Photographer or How to See Things Like a Photographer. If you haven't listened to that, please do, because that will make a massive difference to your results if you're struggling at the moment. And you don't need any equipment to do that at all. This is simply how you look at what's around you and start seeing the photograph before you take it. Once you develop that skill, you can pretty much get what you want with almost any camera setup. So it comes back to what you basically need and, what are you currently using. So I think that pretty much covers it. I hope that's given you some ideas. I hope that's been helpful. If you think I've earned it, please give me a like and a subscribe. And yeah, good luck with your photography. And there are a lot of resources in the podcasts. As I said, I've got a course. It's aimed at DLS and mirrorless, DSLR and mirrorless photography. I did it a few years ago now when DSLR was a bit more available, I guess, than it is now, but the fundamentals are all correct, so I'm not planning to re-release it anytime soon, but it does, and it's quite detailed. It gives you hands-on stuff to do. I'm a big believer in that. It's all very well talking through theory, and this, if you listen to me talking about YouTube versus a course, you'll have heard that as well. And if you actually listened to a recent guest podcast too, you'll have heard that same conversation. But the important thing is to understand the fundamentals. So if you are struggling, make sure you understand the fundamentals. If you've just been learning off YouTube, you haven't done a basic grounded course, then I suggest that you do that first. Build up your knowledge, get some experience, try exercises on the camera, and then it will become very, very clear where your gear is letting you down and basically where you're letting yourself down by not knowing enough. Okay, that's it for this podcast. As I say, I hope you found that useful, and I will speak to you in the next podcast. Bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 Wildlife Calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.